What's up everyone? I wasn't going to make a video, but I was watching a history channel. It was like going over historical facts, which is historical myths or fictions, or basically things that have been repeated so many times that we think they're true, but they're not actually true. And one got me thinking, because it was talking about the Kennedy assassination and Lincoln assassination, and that because those are the two most popular president assassinations, people draw a lot of links between those two, links that aren't actually there. And a lot of the links that were drawn between them were made up or fictional. And I wanted to come on here and talk about why those two are the most popular and most known president assassinations, because they're not the only presidents to have been assassinated. We've had 4 president assassinations and multiple other attempted assassinations. So why is it that we only talk about those 2? And I think it's because of notoriety. Because I'm going to list the other 2 presidents who were killed, and you're not going to know who they were. It was President James Garfield and President William McKinley. And granted, McKinley was way more popular than Garfield was. He was not nearly as popular as Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. And when I mean popular, I don't mean the people loved them, though you could argue about whether these were actually popular when the people loved them or not. I mean, people love them enough to, make them president, but it's because they were notable. They did a lot of things that made them really, really apparent in the public eye. It's like, you can argue or not whether you like Kim Kardashian, but she is very, very well known in America. So they weren't popular, I guess they were well known, whereas James Garfield and William McKinley are less well known, at least to today's standards. Here's why that is. So Abraham Lincoln, as y'all know, ended slavery, and he led to the Civil War. There was a really big thing. He did a lot in his presidency. Mainly those 2 things. And then someone killed him. And so he was already very, very, very notable when he was killed. And of course, it's the fact that after he died, they paraded his body around, the state. I don't know why, they just did. And now we have the funeral industry. But anyway, aside from that, he did a really big thing in American history, so we keep learning about him because what he did was important to American society as a whole today. And with that is his assassination, because he was killed for doing said really big things. Now, the other president who was well known for assassination, Kennedy. Kennedy, relative to Lincoln, didn't do a lot. He didn't lead us through any wars. He didn't pass any really big legislation. Well, he passed legislation, but nothing ground-changing as I'm going to free, and end 500 years of slavery. He didn't do anything big like that. He led us through the Cuban Missile Crisis and through the Bay of Pigs invasion and the early days of the Vietnam War. And he did have some things to say and to do with the Civil Rights Movement. Nothing major, nothing concrete. But he had little hands kind of in everything. But nothing as big as leading us through a civil war, and nothing as big as the 13th Amendment. So why was he popular enough and notable enough to be remembered as one of the 2 big presidents to be assassinated? That's because he did a lot of firsts in his presidency, and he was a big name in the presidency outside of being president. He was one of the few people who were well known for being president for not being the president, if that makes sense. He was the first Catholic to be president. He was the first president to have a televised presidential debate. So not only was he stirring up controversy just for his religious views, he was also the first televised president. He and what he did could be viewed by everyone everywhere. Now, no president had been able to do that before. I mean, Roosevelt had his fireside chats over the radio, but there's a difference between having, radio and hearing a voice versus seeing this man and everything that he does, everything that his family does. And he was a very honest and transparent person. I mean, aside from the multiple affairs that he had. But with his policy making and his intentions, he was very transparent about how things were going within the presidency and within our foreign policy, which made him pretty popular and pretty well known, because it's not a very common thing, especially looking at people who came after him. And also I think the reason that we remember his assassination so well is because there's so much that we don't know about it. You know, with Abraham Lincoln, we could be like, oh, he, freed all the slaves, he ended the Civil War, and a lot of people weren't happy about that, so they killed him. That makes sense. And then you have John F. Kennedy, and it's like, okay, he didn't do a lot. He had ideas to, help out the civil rights movement, but he never acted upon them. Well, he was going to, but we never got the chance because he died. And so there's like speculation of maybe he was killed because people didn't agree with the policies he was gonna make. And, maybe if they had Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat, so racist, in charge, these policies wouldn't have been put through, which they were. So if that was the idea, you failed. But there really couldn't have been a lot of outrage for the things that he was doing because he hadn't done them yet, and there was no way to know if he was going to do them. And I think that's part of the mystery of why would somebody kill John F. Kennedy? Also, the how would somebody kill John F. Kennedy? Because, you have all the conspiracies like, oh, maybe it was actually the FBI or the CIA, maybe it was an inside job by Lyndon. But the thing is, he's so big because he is so unremarkable in comparison. And not be unremarkable as in people who don't remember him as a president because he didn't do much, but as in he was well-known figure to the public eye, but as a president he didn't do nearly as much as Lincoln or other presidents before and after him. But yet he was killed pretty early on in his presidential career. He didn't finish out his first term. And I think that is part of why we're trying to connect these two and why he's so prominent is because it doesn't make sense. And a lot about his assassination does not make sense. And as humans, we tend to focus on the things that don't make sense so we can try and make them make sense, hence all the conspiracy theories around it. That being said, why don't we remember James Garfield and William McKinley? Though I will admit, we remember William McKinley a lot more than Garfield, but I'll get to that. James Garfield did absolutely jack shit. I'm gonna be frank with you. This man did nothing. Like, at all. Like, he semi-enforced Reconstruction after the Civil War, but he was really on the fence about it. He made no major policy changes. He had no controversy around him. This man basically just cruised in the White House for at least 4 years, and then someone killed him. And while that has the same amount of mystery as in if he didn't do anything, why did someone kill him? You also have to remember what was going on at the time. This was the Reconstruction era, and even though he didn't force Reconstruction, even though he didn't enforce it as well as others had, he still enforced it, and so I think in the public mind it was like, oh, he's doing this thing that's not very popular, someone killed him, that's that. Let's move on, because a lot of things are happening, like the rise of the KKK. But also because there wasn't a lot of ways to get information out there. One of the big big things about Kennedy is that you had television for like the first time, and he was televised and he was recorded. You could see him everywhere. You can't see Lincoln or Garfield or McKinley everywhere. So, and because we don't remember him in history because he didn't do anything. We're not going to waste time teaching kids about presidents who didn't do shit. James Garfield's actions had absolutely no repercussions on the course of history. And even though Kennedy's didn't have as many repercussions on the American citizens as Lincoln's did, he still had major repercussions, being the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invasion, and being part of the really, really early stages of the Vietnam War. Now on to William McKinley, who actually had a lot to do with American society, and he did a lot as a president. He was actually very popular and very well known. However, we forget about him because, you know who came after him after he was assassinated? Theodore Roosevelt. And you could say a lot of things about Theodore Roosevelt. You know exactly who the Roosevelts are, which is why you don't know who McKinley is. Because he was overshadowed by Roosevelt. So even though he did a lot, he did the McKinley Tariff, he did, Spanish-American War, which got us into Cuba in the first place, which got us Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And he made Hawaii an official state. He did all of that, but we don't know him because right afterwards, Mr. Teddy Roosevelt, I'm going to put every single, public initiative, every single executive action, and I'm just going to do it. I'm going to bypass Congress and the Supreme Court. I'm just going to do it. And I'm going to end child labor, and I'm going to save a bunch of, trees and shit, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. So it's not that William McKinley didn't do anything important, it's just that somebody who came after him was very, very loud in the waves of history. And that's why we only focus on Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, because aside from then, there was no other important people around. I mean, obviously there were. We don't talk about that. We talk about the one big thing Abraham Lincoln did, and then he was assassinated for it. A lot of great things, a lot of great but big things happened before and after John F. Kennedy. But the mystery around him and his assassination keeps drawing us back, even though he made no real, lasting policies in America. And we forgot about the other two in the middle because one didn't do anything at all. And the other was overshadowed by the people after him. And that is how the human psychology and the human brain, the way we work, has worked against us to erase and or distort history. Which is why you say how many presidents have been assassinated to, well, there's 4. How many they've tried to be assassinated? A lot. Presidential assassinations are actually not new. They are not rare. They happen a lot. And attempts are even more common. I mean, I could go on and on about how many times Lyndon B. Johnson was almost assassinated. Another big thing in the newspaper was that Ronald Reagan was shot. And the reason that people don't fixate on that is because he lived. But even then, if he had died, I don't know if we would even talk about that, because depending on when he would have died in his presidency determines how important we decide that he was. If he was once again like John F. Kennedy really early on, before he passed any long-lasting policies, maybe we wouldn't know who Reagan was. Maybe we wouldn't give a shit about who Reagan was. Maybe he'd be just like James Buchanan or James Garfield or William McKinley, who, just was a president and then they're dead and then we never thought about him again. Or maybe it was near the end, after he passed all of his policies and he died, it would be a big deal because he did a lot to change American society. Or maybe it wouldn't matter at all. Maybe he'd be overshadowed by Bill Clinton. Maybe he'd be overshadowed by whoever was surrounding him. Maybe his effects on American policy were so unpopular that it just makes sense that he would have died. So it's not about, was anything significant about these assassinations? Nothing was significant about any assassination, because assassinations for public leaders are very, very common. It's just how our brains decided to sort this information and determined what was weird about it, what makes sense, or just it's how we piece this together and process the information determines how popular or how well known these presidents' assassinations are. I don't know what the point of this video was. I just wanted to talk about it. So long and thanks for all the fish. Have an excellent weekend.